Hi, my name is Benji and welcome to Dice vs Cards. Today I'm bringing you a Magic the Gathering OCD Modern Deck Tech. And why OCD, you ask? Well, I find myself when brewing that I place artificial rules and limitations on the way I develop a deck, which will sometimes detract from the power level of it, but it's always in the pursuit of making the most competitive but ultimately the most fun and entertaining deck that I can. So I ask the question, do you like to do insane amounts of creature damage out of nowhere, and do you want to draw cards for days? Then this is the deck for you. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Izzet Kiln in the Ice. Now this is a cantrip centric deck where through the raw volume of casting spells you're going to be buffing creatures to do insane amounts of damage, and it's going to make those 20 life points your opponents have seem like very little indeed. So without further ado, let's see what cards are in the box. So let's start the show with a playset of Kiln Fiend, one half of what gives this deck its name. Now this timid little fella might not look much on paper, but as we'll see throughout this deck tech, you're going to be very disappointed if you're not swinging with this for at least 7 to 10 power. We then bring in 4 copies of Thing in the Ice. Now this 0-4 defender's going to quickly go from 4 counters to none with the rest of the cards we have here, and once you awaken that horror, it's going to be a massive tempo loss for your opponent, and you're going to be swinging with 7 power every turn. We then bring in 2 copies of Crackling Drake. Now I considered 2 other creatures for this slot, that being the Nivix Cyclops and Crackling Drake's younger brother, the Enigma Drake. But the reason we ended up with this card is because it's got that inbuilt resilience to graveyard hate, and it's also another way and another means for us to draw cards. Our last creature, we're bringing 2 copies of Bedlam Reveler. Now you'll see as we go on that it's going to be very simple for you to get 6 instants and sorcery cards in your graveyard, so you're more often than not always going to be casting this for 2 mana. And the fact that you're going to get net card draw out of it, even if you've got 1 or 2 cards already in your hand, is an added bonus. So that's our creature package. Let's look at the plethora of non-creature spells we're bringing. So you'll see each of the creatures are going to benefit from the pure volume of casted spells, so I've made a conscious decision to only include 1 cost instants and sorceries, and they're all going to be pursuant to the goal of making our creatures more powerful, more evasive, or giving them protection. Now we start with our cantrips, which is what's going to keep this deck chugging, and whilst some of the choices might not be conventional, they do synergise perfectly with the creatures we have. So we're going to start with a playset of Expedite, because every creature is going to benefit from this, and that surprise attack element can go a long way. We then bring in a playset of Oct, certainly well known to modern players. The ability to scry 1 and draw a card at instant speed means this is an auto-include. We then bring in 4 copies of Peak, because a lot of the time we're going to be attacking, especially with our Kiln Fiend, and it's going to be very susceptible to removal. So having a look to see what they've got before you do commit to attack is very beneficial. And our last cantrip is brought in the form of Slip Through Space, because we want to give evasion to all of our creatures. It only takes 1 attack sometimes to do that last 7, 10, 13 damage to kill your opponent, and making a creature unblockable and drawing a card fits very well here. Next up we're bringing a playset of good old-fashioned Lightning Bolt, because when you consider this is a net 6 damage to your opponent when partnered with Kiln Fiend, and it has the ability of removing your opponent's creatures, paving way for gigantic amounts of damage to go through, then this is a auto-include. Next up we're bringing 4 copies of Mutagenic Growth, because even when you're tapped out, this pump spell is going to invariably be bringing more than 2 power to your creature, and it helps slightly as well in allowing Kiln Fiend to be out of lightning bolt range. We then bring in pseudo removal with a playset of Vapor Snag, because if your opponent's putting big creatures in your way, this is going to do away with that problem, with the added benefit of making your opponent lose one life. Finishing up with our non-creature package, we're bringing 4 copies of Apostle's Blessing. Now I prefer the protection this gives from a colour of your choice, because it's also going to make your creatures unblockable, and as you can see, a recurring theme in this deck is to allow that to happen. So before we move on to our land choices, I just want to give an honourable mention out to Temur Battle Rage, because this is probably an obvious choice for this deck. However, due to my OCD and due to the fact I've already said we're only bringing 1 cross non-creatures, this doesn't have a place here, but I highly recommend you considering it. So we start with our fetch lands. Here we're bringing a playset of the in-colour Scalding Tarn. Now the bulk of the cost of this deck is here, so as a budget alternative you also might want to consider Shivan Reef. Now although that card is a lot less powerful, it's also a hell of a lot less expensive. We're then bringing 2 copies of Flooded Strand, which although it's quite limited compared to the Tarns because it can't fetch up mountains, it still has a home here. And again, if you want to further reduce the cost, you might want to consider 2 copies of the Czech land Sulphur Falls. We're bringing 2 copies of the Izzet Shockland Steam Vents. Now 2 is normally the right fit for most modern decks, and that's no exception here. Next up we're bringing a playset of Spirebluff Canal, because we can achieve most things here with 1 or 2 mana, so even if you draw this later on and it comes in tapped, it's not going to be particularly detrimental to our game plan. Now there's just a paltry 16 lands in this whole deck, so that leaves room only for 2 basic islands and 2 basic mountains, which should still be sufficient to tackle any of your opponent's non-basic land hate. So that's it for our 60 card main board. Let's look at some sideboard options. So building a sideboard is heavily meta dependent, so you're going to want to mix and match and even bring in your own recommendations from the cards that I put forward here, depending on the types of decks that you're encountering the most wherever it is you play. And although I'm going to display the quantities of these cards that I put in my sideboard, I'm not going to talk about them in efforts to encourage you to vary their quantities dependent on your current meta. We start with Ceremonious Rejection, which is obviously going to be targeting opponents with heavy colourless decks. We're then looking at Dive Down, which is a side grade to Apostle's Blessing, because there are a number of scenarios whereby hexproof is going to be better than protection from a colour of your choice. Now sometimes Lightning Bolt just doesn't do it, so Flame Slash is here to take down those 4 toughness creatures. Now similar to Dive Down, Giga Drowse is a side grade, but this time to Vapor Snag, because if your opponent's going wide, that replicate feature is going to allow you to tap down multiple targets. We're then looking at Rending Volley, which similar to Flame Slash is going to take down 4 toughness creatures, but here we're going to do it at instant speed. It's uncounterable, but obviously has the limitation of only targeting white or blue creatures. We're then looking at Shattering Spree, which again is going to target heavy artifact decks, and that replicate ability is going to allow you to spread that wide. Finally, we're looking at Spell Pierce, which has a number of uses, most notably in the early game, and can act as anti-removal and has a number of non-creature targets in those first few turns. So you'll see throughout that we've sacrificed a little bit of power based on the rules and limitations that I've applied in deck building here. But what I can promise you, what we lose out in power, we gain with one of the most fun decks that I've ever played. And if that's your ultimate goal in playing Magic, then I promise you, you will not regret checking this deck out. So that's it from me. I'll see you next time.